Story 1. A student told me that sometimes his dad got drunk and asked his mom for things. As I began to tell him he did not need to elaborate, the student added that his dad would yell the word soup. Took all my restraint not to laugh. Many years later, I still laugh when I think about it. Story 2. I am not a teacher, but this happened when I was 17 at school camp during a bonding exercise. Teacher, tell us 2 truths and 1 lie about yourself, and we have to guess the lie. Weird kid. I play PlayStation, I like Doritos, and I am an alcoholic. Teacher, the lie is you are an alcoholic. Weird kid, got you. I play Xbox. My God, the look on the teacher's face. Story 3. In my public speaking class at a community college, we had to give a speech about an experience that had changed our lives or an important memory and how it shaped who we are. On the first day, a veteran volunteered to go first. He proceeded to talk about the day he was captured and sexually assaulted by an enemy soldier and how he now helps other veterans through the Wounded Warrior Project. It was difficult for anyone to follow. He was one of the nicest people I had ever met. Story 4. I teach middle school. This one still takes the cake. A student said his mom and dad have the same parents. I asked him to clarify because I did not understand, and he said, I only have 1 set of grandparents. They had the same parents. I quickly moved on to the next student to avoid anyone realizing he had just said his parents were siblings. I spoke with him privately the next day. He said he had gotten it mixed up. His parents do not have the exact same parents. They shared a father. I felt much better when the mother called to explain that her elderly stepfather had married her husband's elderly mother. Still strange, but much better. Story 5. He said in the deepest southern drawl that his arm was messed up and proceeded to wildly swing his injured arm around. He was 12, had Erb's palsy, and got detention that day. He might be one of my favorite students. Story 6. I'm not a teacher, but I just completed a first aid course. During introductions, we were asked to say our name and 1 fact about ourselves. One man proudly said he once had over 300,000 unpaid parking tickets. Story 7. I was a student, not a teacher. Once we were going around a circle during percussion camp in the front ensemble, and my teacher said, "Hello everyone. My name is Name, and I have soiled my pants as an adult." Definitely one of the weirder things I have heard. Story 8. I said my dad stole cars. It was something my parents always told us growing up as a joke. The teacher just laughed and said, "That's nice." Story 9. A student told me there is a chapter about him in a dental surgery textbook because of a very rare disorder he had as a child. I may still have that essay. Story 10. During French class, a classmate said that he liked stabbing children. He meant he was referring to fencing but didn't know the exact translation. Story 11. During an introductory activity for my new class, a 9-year-old boy stood up and said that his dog had to wear a cone on its head because his father had his testicles removed. Story 12. I was an ESL teacher in Indonesia. A student once told me that every morning she cleaned the bed sheets. I asked her to clarify, worried she had a serious digestive issue. She answered that she brushed her teeth, washed her face, and cleaned her bed sheets. Story 13. A kid in my kindergarten class said that his pee-pee fell off at Disneyland. I didn't ask any follow-up questions. Story 14. I am not a teacher, but a few years ago, on the first day of school, a student in one of my classes casually said, "I have a restraining order on my dad." Story 15. A 5-year-old said, "My dad clogged the toilet this morning and that's why I'm feeling frustrated." I had asked, "How are you doing this morning?" But I could barely keep from laughing out loud. Story 16. I was not a teacher but a helper in a middle school classroom. A young girl who seemed uninterested said without hesitation that she could chug an entire bottle of beer. She was expelled later that year for keeping drugs in her locker. Story 17. I am not a teacher, but a student in my class named Shane has a medical condition that causes him to grow a lot of hair at an early age. He had a full beard in middle school. He would say, "I'm Shane and I'm very hairy." Story 18. A student once told my wife that her father had to blow into a special device to start his truck. Story 19. I was in a two truths and a lie game. A girl stood up and said she had never been out of the country, that she was a twin, and that she loved playing sports. I knew her and believed she did not have a twin, so I chose that statement as the lie. It turned out she had a conjoined twin that died before birth and was surgically removed, and she is missing the last vertebra of her spine. She showed us the scar. The lie was the first statement. She had been to Mexico. Story 20. Not me but my brother. He told the teacher, "Last night my family ate beaver for dinner. I was much older and had left home by then." The class laughed. The teacher accused him of lying, the principal was involved, and my mother had to attend a meeting. She chewed them up one side and down the other because we had a cousin who was a trapper and he had sent a batch of beaver thighs for the family to enjoy. Although my brother was telling the truth, he later told me he had said it to disrupt the class. Story 21. I teach English as a second language. Every lesson begins with students sharing something good that happened to them over the past week. Kids share very random things, so I have many strange stories. We enforce a rule that they must share only good news so they do not start one-upping each other about whose relative had the worst death. One day a student said he rode his bike over the weekend and fell. I could see where it was going but did not have time to enforce the rule when he said he fell over a wire fence and cut his neck. Kept gushing blood. I reminded him we were only sharing good news, and he replied that it was good because he was still alive. I laughed and agreed, but the damage was done. Every child after him wanted to share the most horrific injuries they had experienced or witnessed. Story 22. He has been to juvenile detention multiple times and is currently on probation. Then he pulled his pants up so everyone could see his ankle monitor. That was something. Story 23. A guy in my class introduced himself by telling us how he decided he wanted to study philosophy because one day he was very high, urinating in the street, and he saw a couple of people working and wondered what they were doing. He realized his passion was to wonder. He dropped out 2 months later. Story 24. My friend is quiet. He doesn't speak unless spoken to. He's cool and has hobbies he enjoys. In the second year I knew him, the teacher asked, and he said he was a professional bowler with a 300 game. I said, "Why haven't you told me this? That's amazing." I had known him for a year and never knew that. Story 25. I had students aged 11 share strategies for dealing with difficult emotions, each taking a turn in a big circle. One girl said she dug her nails into her face when she felt stressed or anxious. I explained to the class why self-harm is not a good coping strategy. Story 26. When I was in my first year at university, my law and society professor had each student stand up, say their name, and explain why they chose law school. One student stood up and said his name, and the professor interrupted, asking, "Anon, are you related to X?" The student replied, "Yes, professor. He is my grandfather." The professor grew excited and began talking about what a great man X was and that he hadn't heard of him in years. When the professor asked how he was, Anon replied, "He is dead, sir." The whole class tried to hold back their laughter. It pretty much broke the class on the first day. Story 27. A classmate once said his grandparents were arrested for keeping several adopted children in cages. He said he used to play with the children when he was young but was too young to understand that their conditions were abnormal. The children were kept in cages and locked in rooms for years before authorities discovered them and arrested the grandparents. I am not a teacher. The person who told the story was a classmate when we were young adults. Story 28. Hearing the statement, "I have had my hand up a sheep's bum," shocked me slightly. I am the child of a farming family and helped during lambing season. Story 29. In my psychology class, we were talking about the early signs of serial killers, and the quietest girl in the class told a story from when she lived in Chicago. She had a friend in 5th grade who would stomp on baby birds and once put his hamster in the microwave. His parents had difficulty managing his behavior, so they sent him to his grandmother. When she woke him for school, he stabbed her to death. That was disturbing. Story 30. I was in one of the earliest small, required classes for my teaching degree, and everyone was studying to teach. It was day 2 or 3, and we were doing a get-to-know-you activity where we shared something about ourselves. I don't remember the exact question, but it was about what you regret or would take back. A man came in late after almost everyone had answered the question. The professor asked him the question. He thought for a moment and said, "I regret letting my friend talk me into dropping acid." The class was silent for a good 20 seconds until the professor said, "Maybe next time we only share things that are legal." I never saw him in any other teaching classes after that. I still laugh about it to this day. Story 31. In a small class, while students introduced themselves one by one to a new student, a woman said her parents had paid for her nose surgery and breast augmentation. Story 32. I have 2 thumbs on this hand. I am raising cockroaches in my closet to sell to the reptile shop. Thanks for the silver. I want to clarify that these quotes come from different kids, but it is definitely more entertaining to imagine them being the same. Also, I learned so much about raising cockroaches from the comments. I wish I had asked more follow-up questions at the time. Story 33. I am not a teacher, but the daughter of one. A student told my dad, during a fun fact question, in detail how his goldfish had died that morning and how he experimented on their corpses. The student had pictures on his phone showing the skin removed and the intact skeleton beside it. He is a successful taxidermist now, so silver linings, I guess. Story 34. My first year as an earnest, idealistic teacher in a very rough, underserved area. I had all the students sit in a circle on the first day to talk about what we had done that summer. I pointed to a student who had been engaged with me before class and asked, "What did you do this summer that could inspire us?" He answered, "I did the last 2 months of a sentence for stealing a car." I had not expected that. I pointed to another student and said, "Okay, that's great. Let's talk about what you did this summer." That student said, "Yes, I had such a good summer. I went to camp and, let me stop lying. I did the last 2 months of a sentence with that guy because I stole that car with him." Story 35. It wasn't weird but actually cute and funny. I taught 5th grade. One student introduced himself as name, but said I could call him LeBron. He was obsessed with LeBron James, and I called him LeBron whenever I wanted his attention. Great kid. Story 36. I'm a teacher from the United Kingdom and the form tutor for a Year 7 class of 11-year-olds. To get to know each other on the first day, I had them take turns saying their name, which primary school they had come from, and an interesting fact such as a favorite food or color. When we reached the last student, he said his fact. He has 6 fingers on one hand. Coolest student ever. Story 37. I taught in an elementary school for the past few years. One child told me he had been a dragon when he was born but changed into a human as he grew older. He was absolutely convinced and could not be persuaded. Story 38. Okay, so I had psychology back in the spring semester before coronavirus disease 2019, and I sat next to a girl I had been friends with since high school. The professor asked her for a fun fact, and she said she liked to watch people get cut open. She obviously said it for effect, but she clarified that she liked watching videos of people having plastic surgery because it is satisfying to watch. Story 39. He said that when he wiped in the bathroom this morning, there was blood on the toilet paper. Laughing out loud. Story 40. Oh my gosh, not a teacher, but a student. Introducing ourselves in my 10th grade social studies class, I said, "Hi, I'm Catbomb4. I really like trees. I swear I have a tree fetish." The teacher gave me a what the heck look, said okay, and quickly moved on. I had confused fetish with the word obsession. It was awkward, but I did not mean to say I was sexually attracted to trees. Story 41. Even though I'm a professor, nothing revealed by that question has ever been as awkward or uncomfortable as an incident from when I was a student. I was in my Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing. If you've never been in an arts program, it probably won't surprise you to learn they can attract unusual personalities. On the first day of a fiction workshop, the professor asked us to share something interesting about ourselves. One student, Ashley, used the opportunity to recount a long history of drug abuse and the prolonged psychosis that followed. She did not give a quick answer. Instead, she delivered a long, drawn-out list of every drug she had tried, followed by a catalog of each delusion she had experienced. The only one I remember is that at one point she was convinced she was a millionaire and that her family was hiding her money from her. All of this was presented in a monotone monologue. Her eyes glazed over, and it lasted at least 5 minutes. It ended in a long, awkward silence before the professor said, "Well, that was definitely something interesting," and moved on to the next person. Story 42. I was teaching a 10th grade honors English class once, and this pleasant young woman used the C word. See you next Tuesday. I had not had any trouble with her, so I was a bit shocked. The whole class went dead silent. I told her she could not use that word in class, and she was confused about which word I meant. Finally, I said the C word. She repeated it and then admitted she did not know there was anything wrong with it because her parents use it at home all the time. The rest of the class told her it was bizarre that she was using it. She was not Australian. Story 43. Not a teacher, but on the first day of 9th grade we had to form a circle and say one thing about ourselves that we thought was unique. When it was this dude's turn, let's call him Mike, he stood up and in a really serious tone said that his mom and dad grow weed. His house was raided the next day and his dad was arrested. Shaking my head. Story 44. I am not a teacher, but a guy in several of my high school classes would say he had met Ron Jeremy when the class was playing Two Truths and a Lie. He was not lying and would always show the class the picture they had taken together. Story 45. I tried to make conversation with a 6th grade boy who did not have any friends in my class. I asked him what music he listened to, and he said mukbang soundscapes. If you do not know, mukbang is when people eat a ridiculous amount of food in one sitting. Story 46. I do not ask for a fun fact. On the first day, I always ask, what is your most recent obsession? It is a low-stakes way to build affinity networks. In my first semester, a student said air as in oxygen. Story 47. I am a student. A classmate said that he loves chicken nuggets, then sat down and did not speak to anyone else for a month. I have so much admiration yet confusion for him. Story 48. One person said, I love rap. Sometimes my friends and I get together to listen to rap. Some of my favorite rappers include Tupac, Dr. Dre, Eminem, and the Notorious B.I.G. My favorite rap song is English was not his first language. He had us in the first half, not gonna lie. Edited to add the continuation to make it clear everyone understood what he meant once he started listing the famous rappers. Story 49. I am a trainer at a bank, and I have learned some really interesting things about my colleagues during icebreakers. One man used to be in a fairly successful metal band. Another can solve a Rubik's Cube in under 2 minutes. Yes, I made him prove it. One woman was a professional pianist for a time, and another can read tarot cards. I am seriously thinking of organizing an employee talent show. Story 50. Maybe not weird, but one I will always remember. The boy who wrote that he likes chewing bubble gum and drinking from a water bottle. I also had another boy who said that he always says he is tired even when he is not. Story 51. Along the same avenue. After a winter half-term, the teacher asked, "How was your break?" My class was silent for some glorious seconds. When it was my turn, I said, "Well, my granddad died and my dad got married." Yes, in that order. My teacher asked my mom if it was true at parents' evening a few days later. Sorry, Mr. Moore. Story 52. A first-grade student told me she liked spending time with her father's special friend more than with her mother because the friend bought her things in exchange for not telling her mother. 2 months later, at parent-teacher conferences, I sat at the table knowing the child's father was having an affair, and the child's mother had no idea. Story 53. I work with preschoolers, 3 to 5-year-olds. One day I had the children go around and tell one thing that made them special. Most responses were typical. I am really good at drawing. I have 2 big sisters, and so on. Then I reached one little girl who was very cute and sweet. She looked me dead in the eyes and said, I have been around forever. I have seen the whole world and I know everything. She was completely serious and it felt unsettling. When I pressed her, she could not find the words to explain but kept saying she came from the sand and was frustrated that she could not explain it better. I did not used to believe in past lives, but now I am not so sure. Story 54. I was not a teacher, but on the first day of high school, when we did introductions, one of the popular girls said, "Hi, I'm Maisie, and I'm trash, wait. No, I am fan trash." She then explained that she read smutty fan fiction to any teacher who asked what fan trash is. We were 11 and this was a British high school. Story 55. On the first day of 6th grade in my math class, the teacher had every student introduce themselves and say whether they went by a nickname. One student asked to be called the Surgeon General in a confused attempt at humor. He thought it was funny and we all laughed at how odd it was. There was no real thought behind the joke, as he was just being random. The teacher remembered it, and whenever the student acted out in class, the teacher would refer to him as Mr. Surgeon General when reprimanding him, much to the student's embarrassment, laughing out loud. Story 56. She relieved herself in public. I still remember her full name, so good job, freshman from 8 years ago. Story 57. I remember one kid used the opportunity to explain that he believed in the flying spaghetti monster. Story 58. Hi, I am Dorian, and coming to university is the only time I am allowed out because I am under house arrest for attempted murder. I am a first-year university student. Story 59. I asked my students what they wanted to be after they graduated. A girl who sat near the back and was a little edgier was next to answer. She looked around and said, "I want to be a mortician because living people are the worst to work with. The dead don't talk back to you, they don't demand things. I'm in control." No one spoke to her for the rest of the 15-week class, except me by default. Story 60. I work at a nature center as an informal teacher. Once I had a student about 6 or 7 years old who, while referring to an action figure he had found in the room, said that he used to have one of those but then his house burned down. When we were talking about the zodiac and reached Cancer, the crab, another student announced that they had cancer for 2 years. Story 61. My son told his 7th grade teacher that he had a Sasquatch uncle. The teacher was doubtful until my wife wrote her a note scolding her for not believing and supporting the story my son told. In retrospect, it is likely the teacher was humoring everyone while thinking my wife was a lunatic. Story 62. I had an in-depth conversation with an almost 6-year-old about being a secret werewolf hunter at night. The student described how they track and often make friends with werewolves. They also demonstrated a surprising amount of knowledge about the moon. I laughed. For those concerned about imaginative lying, this is very typical for young students and is one of the ways they assess adult reactions. Imaginative storytelling is an important part of development. At certain points, children start telling stories that they know are not true, which can be annoying and is also a valuable window into a complex part of cognitive development. Story 63. In my history class, someone said they like to start fires. Story 64. I had a student whose identical twin brother was 2 years younger. His father was a professional athlete who could afford to freeze an embryo after it had been split. His wife later carried both embryos at separate times. Story 65. One student licked the Escherichia coli petri dish in advanced placement biology. It was his fun facts about me in the yearbook. Story 66. I had a friend in college who felt she never had a good fun fact, so she memorized all of the United States state birds to use as one. She expected someone to quiz her, but when she shared it in class no one did, so she had memorized them for nothing. Story 67. One child spoke about how his mother was a methamphetamine addict and that he had not seen her in 13 years. Story 68. He said, "I love to God." I had a Korean student on an international visa. His host family was Korean as well, but they were very strict about English at home and very religious. On the first day of school, the student was very nervous, trying to fit in, and was clearly saying only things he had rehearsed with his host family. Something got lost in translation at church, and he thought he could use the word God as a verb meaning to worship God. I taught him in United States history. He was bright and always brought an interesting perspective, but the language barrier was almost comical. Story 69. In a sex education class, a 12-year-old was very worried about having sexually transmitted infections, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, and human immunodeficiency virus. The child said their parents have been using drugs and have shared many syringes, even when their mother was pregnant, so they do not know if they have any of these infections. This was very sad and shocking for the teachers and the other children in the class. Story 70. The coach at the time was not a teacher, so the relationship felt different. It was the end of year 7 at a United Kingdom school. We were 12. The question was to say something that had changed about yourself over the past year. One boy stood up and simply said a personal change. Story 71. It was not weird, but hilarious. I asked him to say his name and a little-known fact about himself. He said his name. When I prompted him for the little-known fact, he said, "I am black." Story 72. High school teacher here. I usually do this at the beginning of the year with my freshmen, but I have them do it on a note card or piece of paper for students who are shy. They also seem much more comfortable sharing information on the card that they probably should not say aloud. A lot of responses are strange. Most of the time it is students trying to be funny. The most bizarre was a girl who said the most interesting thing she did in the summer was dig up the corpse of her cat. Story 73. A classmate introduced himself on the first day by saying he was very good at finding other people's vulnerabilities and exploiting them. Somehow he did not make any friends during the 2 years. It turned out he was the psychopath he had described. Story 74. Once during a Model United Nations conference, the chairs asked us to say our names and a fun fact. People were saying their zodiac signs. A peculiarity in my language is that the sign Virgo is called Virgem, which is the same word as virgin. The conference was in English instead of our native language, so you can imagine how it went. Hi, my name is Anna and I am a virgin. Story 75. One time in 4th grade I said I had needles in my backpack and that I stabbed myself with them 3 or 4 times a day. The teacher asked where I got the needles and I said my mom and dad got them for me. It turned out she did not realize that the individualized education program for diabetes was for me, and there was a long talk with my parents and me about how I should not talk about stabbing myself with needles or say that I have needles. I now just say I have been diabetic since I was 1. Story 76. A 13-year-old said, "My brother ate my goldfish." Her friend said, "It's true. I was there." Story 77. I had a 3rd grader in my gifted and talented class. This is relevant. Her classroom teacher told me that when she asked the class a question, this girl answered that she likes to break things and make voodoo dolls of her enemies. Needless to say, I told the teacher that somewhere in an 8-year-old girl's bedroom there is a voodoo doll of her and probably one of me as well. Story 78. Oh God. I think most experienced teachers would never ask that question, knowing the crazy things kids would say. Most of the strange things my students told me were volunteered. For example, a middle school girl seriously told me she planned to spend the summer with her grandmother, the Queen of London. Story 79. A girl in one of my high school classes announced that she was supposed to be dead as her fun fact. When she was born, she and 2 other newborns contracted a disease, and the other 2 died. Story 80. I was asked at preschool what my parents did for a living. I said that when men came to see my mother, she made money. My mother was an accountant who worked from a home office. Story 81. It wasn't the student who said this. It was the teacher herself who told the class. She has a huge cardboard cutout of a stormtrooper in her classroom. On her desk there is a stormtrooper mug, a plush toy, and several other stormtrooper items. At the beginning of the year we introduced ourselves and something we liked. She went first and said, "I've always had a crush on those sexy stormtroopers." One time, one of my students dressed up as one, and it was very awkward. Story 82. We had a roundtable introduce yourself session in college where we said what we like to do in our free time. I said I like writing poetry, and the professor mocked me. Apparently he thought that was strange for a student to say. Story 83. Not a teacher, but I always answer, I have glue inside my brain. Long story short, I had a brain aneurysm at 15, and they fixed it with glue. Story 84. In 1st grade, for show and tell, I stood in front of the class and said, "Yesterday I learned my dad is from Mexico." My teacher looked at my pale skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, and European surname, squinted and asked, "Do you mean he is from New Mexico?" I insisted no, from Mexico. There are, of course, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Mexican people and genetics are tricky, but I understood her confusion. I went home and told my mom. She said no one in our family was from Mexico. My dad was from Ohio and a grandfather was from Texas. That was about as close as we got. I still have no idea where that came from. My dad is mixed, so maybe people were trying to explain that to me and my childish brain could not compute it. I remember being very confused about who my father was when I was little because he worked far away and I hardly saw him. I also have a distinct memory of a man returning from a Navy cruise when I was little and my mom telling me he was my father. So who knows, perhaps my mom was not sure either. Story 85. I visited a college with my high school class. One of the professors introduced himself and asked if anyone had questions, concerns, or even death threats. I asked if he had ever received death threats, which was relevant because he had held a government position involving surveillance. He said no. Story 86. During Two Truths and a Lie, a student said, I like video games. I like school. Sometimes I perform experiments on stray animals in my neighbor's yard. I use a needle to take blood from one animal and inject it into another. I stared in disbelief. He said the recipient animal would then start to exhibit behaviors and features of the donor and that he wanted to be a biochemical engineer. I hope that last one was the lie. I never found out, but I reported the incident. Story 87. I had a student who used to appear on Barney. An 8th grader at the small, largely economically disadvantaged school where I used to teach had been mountain climbing, skydiving, paragliding, and bungee jumping all before finishing 8th grade, and she had pictures of everything. This semester I have a student who plans to play baseball at university. They are taking introductory courses at the community college where I work to finish them early in the summer. They already have an agent and are in talks with Major League Baseball. Another student this semester aspires to be a United States Senator. His first paper described visiting his father at work in Washington, D.C. Story 88. I had a student tell me he did parkour professionally and wanted to become a stuntman, but his parents wanted him to have a backup plan, so he was attending college. He then shamelessly promoted his YouTube account and Instagram and told us all to check him out and follow him. I am pretty sure he was not a professional. He said he was YouTube famous when he introduced himself and said, "Some of you might recognize me," but no one did. Story 89. He was a quiet kid, not a good student, and someone who used marijuana. He loved me for some reason. I did not criticize him for using marijuana. One day he told me he had seen his mother and grandmother murdered in front of him. Mushrooms and other drugs were his way of coping with the trauma. Story 90. I'm not a teacher, but my friend said masturbation is his passion. Story 91. One of my students said that his fun fact was that he hates Israel. It was awkward. He was a 6th grade boy from India. Story 92. A preschool child transferred from France. He barely spoke English, so he did not talk much and was generally very quiet. Halfway through the year, at snack time, he came back in, kicked the door open like RoboCop, and announced, "The cat is dead. We are dog people now." He then quietly sat down and ate his snack. Story 93. Follow-up question. Teachers who put everyone on the spot like that, what the fuck? Story 94. I think his name was Carter. He stood up and said that, in college, he had sex with a girl in the bathroom. He was expelled. Story 95. During my freshman year of college, we took turns introducing ourselves. One guy said, "My name is XXX, and yes, I am a Satanist." I laughed. He just wanted to get that out of the way immediately. Story 96. In a community college elementary education reading class, we had to introduce ourselves and say something interesting. Most of the class went through the motions, saying where they were from, why they wanted to teach, and a fun fact about themselves. At the end of the first day, our professor said she would go last. She then described a rough summer when her son and her husband were diagnosed with cancer. She nearly broke down in tears. That was sad enough, but in the next class it seemed the students tried to outdo each other with tragic stories. I found it hard to believe there could be so many difficult stories in one freshman-level education class. One student described being raped earlier that summer and said her trial was coming up. I was stunned. A couple of students later, another student told how a state college roommate committed suicide in their dorm room, and that was why she was at community college. I sat at my desk trying to catch my breath. Another woman said she was at community college to get a degree because she had to raise 6 children at the age of 21. Someone said they were proud of her for bettering herself for her kids. She then said she did not have to pay because a man was covering her classes after she had told him one of the babies was his. She quietly added that he was not the father. I was taken aback. One of the last students stood up and immediately began crying. Students and the teacher encouraged her to sit down, take her time, or excuse herself. She said she had to tell her story. She explained that her father was in jail for murdering her mother because he suspected her of cheating. Everyone was stunned and students hugged each other. I do not know if that makes me insensitive, but I felt very uncomfortable. The teacher said she got more out of this than she expected. The class was strange for the rest of the semester, but we got through it together. Story 97. Stands up. Hello, my name is David. I run cross country, and this morning I peed for 5 minutes straight. Sits down. This is a college freshman, by the way. Story 98. I'm not a teacher, but in my junior year we had a student in class who had Tourette's and was on the autism spectrum. The teacher asked if we had done anything fun or interesting over the summer. When it got to him, he excitedly said, I went on vacation, visited my grandmother, and she let me have tons of ice cream and we played a lot. She's a fucking bitch. The teacher replied, Okay. Anyone else want to share? The whole class died laughing. He usually did not yell out swears in class, so I think maybe his grandmother really was a fucking bitch. Story 99. Obligatory. Not a teacher. In my first year of college, a guy told the class that he hated dogs. We were veterinary students. 1 year later he dropped out, and 3 years later I dropped out too. Story 100. A kid said he was Timothy McVeigh's cousin or second cousin a long time ago. It was not bragging, just a matter-of-fact comment about himself. Story 101. The strangest one, thankfully, was written down. I had the children draw around their hands and write 5 facts on their fingers for a display board. Examples were I have 2 dogs and I like to play guitar. One child wrote my mum killed my brother. I thought he was joking, but he was not. Story 102. My fact always receives a lot of responses. I have a birth defect of my tongue that makes it very long and pointed, and when I stick it out people tend to be really shocked. In primary school, we once had to make a calendar of a typical month. I wrote I fight with my mum or my mum hits me almost every day. My childhood was pretty terrible. Story 103. My mum's friend's brother has a weight problem. It is easy to see why when you see what he eats. He encourages his young sons to share his poor diet and other bad habits. When his oldest son started secondary school at 11, he was asked for a fact about himself and said he could eat 2 very large Cornish pasties and a cake and still be able to eat dinner. I heard the son gets bullied for his size, but his father still encourages him to eat like that. His mother tries to discourage this, but one of the bad habits the father passes on is disrespect toward women. The oldest of his male cousins was bullied for his size, so he keeps begging the father to try to help him lose weight because the bullying will only get worse. The father will not listen and blames everyone else. Story 104. This happened during the game 2 Truths and a Lie. A student wrote that he had 4 concussions as his truth. At lunch, I told the physical education teacher about it, and she called him a liar and said he had 7. Story 105. I was probably one of those weird answers. I'm Cats Over Flowers, and I'm part of a sword fighting group. I don't think many teachers believed me, but it was true. Story 106. I'm not a teacher, but in my college animation class one student talked about how he had an array of cheeses and began listing all the cheeses he owned. Another student said he hates eating and would rather have photosynthesis because eating is a waste of time and takes too long. Story 107. Hi. I am insert fake name here and I really enjoy shooting people with guns. Wait, no. I like shooting guns with my friends. I do not shoot people, I swear. We did not believe her. Story 108. Obligatory. I'm not a teacher, but I ask this question in job interviews. A potential candidate said he had cured his allergies and proceeded to call me a sheep for going to the doctor. He did not get the job. Story 109. A fun fact about someone in my class was that they worked at a sex shop. Story 110. This is not exactly the same prompt the original poster asked about, but this is what happened. Student: I don't need to learn math to work. Teacher: well, what kind of work do you plan to do in life? Student: deal drugs for my cousin until I have enough money to set up my own operation. The kid had goals. Teacher: do you know how much math goes into cutting, weighing, and calculating your product, as well as keeping track of finances? There was silence. The student became a model student in my 8th grade math class after that. Story 111. I am not a teacher, but at my Christian university the question went around the class and landed on a student who said he had tried cannabis sprinkled with cocaine. Everyone's jaws dropped. Story 112. A student in creative writing said she likes to drink naked juice while she writes. She sat back down, and it was not until the second quarter that we realized she meant the juice. Story 113. I had a student whose fun fact was that he had been stabbed 15 times while holding a hunting knife in each hand. One classmate said he was lying, so he lifted his shirt partway and 8 or 9 scars were immediately visible. Everyone became very quiet. Story 114. I was a summer camp director for children aged 6 to 12. On the first day, as part of an icebreaker, I asked them to write down what they wanted to be when they grew up. A couple of years ago, a child wrote that he wanted to be a rapper but insisted on his spelling. I let it slide. Story 115. We played a game where students had to say something they had done that no one else had done. One girl said she ate a piece of dog feces. She won. Story 116. 2 truths, 1 lie. One of his statements was that he kicked his mom when she was pregnant. He then clarified he meant while he was in the womb. No one laughed, and I instantly knew what kind of kid I would be dealing with all year. Story 117. In my philosophy of religion class, a man introduced himself as a magician. About 30 seconds later, he promptly left the room because his leg was on fire. No explanation was ever provided. Story 118. In a psychology class, a woman said she could death growl and then performed an impromptu 5-minute concert without being asked. Story 119. Not a student, but a teacher. When I was in 8th grade, we had a new science teacher. She was 26 years old, and it was her first full-time teaching job. She was laid back and turned every Friday into a free period so we could goof off. She had us write anonymous questions for her to answer. No topic was off limits. She answered questions about her sex life, her college experiences, drugs she had taken, and so on. The one that stuck out the most was her admission that she was cheating on her fiancé with the shop teacher. Story 120. I am a high school physics teacher. I do not ask my students to answer this question in front of the class, but one day, out of the blue, one of my nicest students told me that when she was in elementary school, she wanted to grow up to be an assassin. Story 121. I am not a teacher, but when I attended a pre-college course we played 2 truths and a lie. A big, scary, very hairy man stood up and said, I have a cat. I am in jail, and my favorite color is green. We assumed the cat and the color, but he said, no, you cannot have cats in jail. He was a pretty cool dude. Story 122. When I was in high school, a teacher asked us a question about something we enjoyed. I remember almost everyone gave normal responses, but one student who had never spoken before simply sat with a serious look and said, I like blood. There was an awkward silence, and the teacher moved on. I think he moved later that year, so I don't know what happened to him, but there was definitely something unsettling about him. Story 123. Our biology teacher had us write something personal about ourselves, and she put the papers on the wall. No names were attached. One person wrote, I am gay. I looked around, as a fellow gay man, and none of the students seemed to care about what was on the wall. Story 124. I had just finished telling the class how I kept pet ducks in high school that were blue, orange, and green as ducklings. Then someone said he was a falconer and had his own red-tailed hawk, which completely outshone my story. Story 125. I'm not a teacher, but when I was in 6th grade homeroom, we went around saying our names and a fact about ourselves. It came to a skinny blonde boy who popped his glass eye into his hand and said, "I was hit by a truck." After class, we all wanted to know more, and it turned out he had lost his eye to cancer, although he had once been hit by a truck. Story 126. When I was in 9th grade, we were asked a question. I gave a lame answer, but another student volunteered that he wrote fiction in his spare time. The teacher scolded him and moved on. A couple of months later, the same student left a notebook on his desk. It was filled with stories about several of his female classmates. I never found out what happened to him. We never saw him again. Story 127. I have a questionnaire in which I ask my college students what the last book they read was, whether they enjoyed it, and to briefly explain why or why not. One student said the last book they read was The Dresden Files and that they really liked it because it was full of magic and adventure. I smiled. The student then added that they had been in jail and there was nothing else to do. I was taken aback. Story 128. I was a preschool teaching assistant. We were doing a silly, "Tell me what animal you would be" circle time. One of the children said, "My dead dog." I said I was sorry to hear his dog had died. He said it was okay because his dad had shot it in the head after it was run over. Story 129. One woman at work told us that she once made black pudding with her own blood and invited friends to dinner to taste it. Story 130. It was not really weird. She said her name was Ella and that she had a recording contract. I thought that was kind of cool, but I didn't think much of it. 2 years later, she was better known to most of the world as Lorde when her song Royals blew up everywhere. Story 131. I led a small group of freshmen when I was a teaching assistant as an undergraduate. One student proudly stood up and professed his unironic love for Nickelback. They were his favorite band, and he had been to many of their concerts. Who knew they were even still performing? He said he would fight anyone in the group who told him otherwise. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.